So, Kit, I want to ask you a few questions along the idea of strategies for sustained growth in private equity. And my first question is, based on your extensive experience, what are the key strategies for driving sustainable growth in PE-backed companies? That's a loaded
Yeah,
question, but where would you start with that?
it's a great question. And I'm going to answer the question by sharing with you and the audience the fact that one of the four peer advisory groups that we host at the Operators is called Strategic Growth Council. And we tackle this very topic. And in fact, we use the case method of solving strategic growth dilemmas in portfolio companies. And one of the cases that we processed as a group of peers, had to do with the topic of culture and human capital alignment as the first critical step in the process of driving growth, of value creation in portfolio companies. And as a result of that case, we've had a couple of expert speakers come to the group and talk with us about human capital alignment and the importance of culture. And, one of the things that I've learned is that you can have all the best processes, systems, technology. You can do all the right things from a structural standpoint. But if the cultural elements are not in place, it's essentially all for naught, because at the end of the day, it's people that are left to implement and make things happen. and
Yeah.
and if the culture is not aligned and people don't really understand what the core values are and how they fit into the big picture and where they're going, it doesn't all happen. So in the Strategic Growth Council, we identified as a group roughly a dozen levers or value creation strategies. And the very first one is just that. It's that human capital cultural alignment. And I could go on if you'd like. I mean, I could rattle off the other ones, because you said, what are the key strategies for driving sustainable growth? And
Yeah.
it's not
No.
limited to one. But would you like me to go on, Jack?
Actually, yes, I would. Let me ask you a couple of questions. I think that's super critical. What you're saying there is the idea with the Strategic Growth Council and putting together these 12 value creation strategies. And as you'd mentioned, Kit, it starts with human capital alignment and the importance of culture as the first step. And I think that's critical. And making the assumption that you have the proper human capital alignment and you have a healthy culture, which is another, I mean, that's probably another conversation, Kit, an hour conversation just on that topic alone. But
Right.
how important is the alignment of not just the people, the human capital alignment, but how important is the alignment of the people, the processes, and the technology in successful PE firms? And what role does that alignment play in growth? So basically, I want to take my first question and expand on that. And the first part is human capital alignment. But then what is the value in making sure that your processes and your technology are aligned with the people and the culture to support the success?
It's critical, extremely important. And, in fact, I sort of misspoke, because the first step is maybe a given to some folks, but rather than starting with the human capital and culture within the portfolio company, the first step is really ensuring that there is communication and alignment on the investment thesis from the
Yeah.
board.
Mm-hmm.
So you really have, a mandate from the board. This is the expectation. This is where we're going. And then it's up to management to kind of weigh in with, is this possible? Is this real? And it's an ongoing dialogue and communication. So I sort of left that part of the process out. Then you get into the culture piece. And then in many portfolio companies, particularly in the lower middle market to middle market, it may be the first institutional capital, and there may not be the systems, the processes, the technologies even in place at all. And the management team that is in place, this sounds very pejorative and sort of a overgeneralization perhaps, but in many cases, the management team needs to be professionalized. And so the second step, therefore, is improving human capital talent with new hires and or doing assessments on the existing talent. The next step after that is what you were alluding to, the alignment of processes, systems, technology, and the assurances that the human capital piece connects with each of those. In other words, people understand why and where and how and what they're responsible for and how it all ties together.
Kit, one of the things that can often be a buzzword, two things that we've been speaking about so far in this conversation. One is culture, organizational culture, and the other one is people, processes, and technology. Right? I mean, you hear that a lot. And I think that, and the reason I say they're a buzzword is I think they are to a certain degree, but the value of those ideas is incredible. And one of the things that we've seen, and I'd be curious to get your thoughts, and I would say two things when it comes to organizational culture. We've seen anecdotally and just through conversations with other PE executives and portfolio executives that there has become more attention on organizational culture over the last few years, number one. And number two, that there is a separation of portfolio executives when it comes to organizational culture. In other words, some of them, it could perhaps be more of a buzzword and they don't pay much attention to it and they think it's important, but they don't quite, spend the attention and time it may deserve to ensure that you have a healthy organizational culture. So
Right.
I'm going to stop there. I don't know if that was more of a question or a statement, but what's your thoughts on those ideas?
Well, I completely agree with what you said, and I'll go one step further. I would say there's not only is there more emphasis being placed on the role of culture and aligning the human element before thinking about systems, processes, technology, reporting, etc. But in addition to that, I sense that in the private equity sponsors, at the board level, there's more of an acknowledgement that the human element, is more than just accounts, is more than just payroll and benefits. And
Yeah,
so you
right.
see the rise in some private equity firms of the chief people officer or the chief human resources officer. And in some cases, I think they're just there for hiring purposes. But in many cases, it's an acknowledgement that the role of culture, human capital alignment in a portfolio company and across the portfolio has merit, has value, is worth looking at. Historically, I think there's been a scarcity of respect for human resources, human capital, culture. It's like it's not quantitative.
Yeah.
It's like the icky soft stuff, and like marketing, it doesn't gain the respect amongst financial analysts or ex Wall Street types that make up the bulk. Ex bankers that make up most of the ranks of at least deal teams in private equity. Did that make
Right.
sense,
It
Jack?
did. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Kit, one thing I want to ask you, and I'm going to put you on the spot because I like case studies, but just generally here, we don't need details. But could you share with our listeners an example of how strategic planning for human capital alignment has significantly impacted a portfolio company's performance? Do you have any example that you can share with our listeners? Just share a quick story.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes the process of strategic planning seems rote and boring and sort of, everybody thinks of, okay, we're going to go to an offsite retreat and, we're going to use a process or a formula or a guide who's going to put us through an effort. And at the end of this, we're going to have a list of tactics or next steps. And it's, in many cases, I think the reaction that people have to a strategic planning process is, what's really going to change? How's this going to impact me? We've done this before. But I think, in private equity, there's just not a huge amount of time to make change happen.
Yeah.
And so everything just is on a different level of urgency, number one. And number two, in some cases, that process of strategic planning has tremendous revelations. And, what is revealed in some cases is that the original, remember, I talked about the original given as the investment thesis.
Yeah.
In some cases, you can acknowledge or realize or come to agreement amongst the management team that the whole premise of the investment thesis is on faulty footing and really does not hold merit. In some cases, that might mean that the sellers sort of misrepresented reality. In some cases, it might mean the due diligence didn't take place very well, didn't happen very well. In some cases, it might mean that the operating partner's experience that was being leveraged was not as relevant as everyone thought. But regardless of the reason behind that, what often happens in strategic planning, in my experience with private equity owned portfolio companies, is a significant shift happens. So the example that comes to mind is there was an acquisition that was going to be happening, and we were doing strategic planning around that acquisition, the implications of that acquisition, and questions come up inevitably, and sometimes questions result in the need for more data and an analysis around that. And in this particular case, that data revealed that the strategy was completely misguided, to put it simply. So what the result of the strategic planning session was not your ho-hum standard, here's what we're going to do, and here's how we're going to do it, and here's the timeline, and here's the metrics, and here are the champions, and so forth. But rather, it was sort of turning the company in a whole new direction as a result of the fact that, by definition, strategic planning means bringing a number of wise voices to the table to be heard.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if that was as crystal clear or poignant. I didn't get into the details, but hopefully that suffices. Jack, what do you think?
Yeah, no, that was great, Kit. Thank you. Yeah, no, great answer and great insight. I appreciate it. And certainly this idea of a different level of urgency, which I want to ask you about here in a in a few minutes. I want to dig into that just a little bit more, but that couldn't be any more true. But in your perspective, Kit, what are some of the emerging trends, whether it's people, process, or technology in the PE sector that firms should be aware of to stay competitive? Is there anything you see? I know we talked about kind of the change or the trend over the last few years with perhaps more focus on organizational culture.
Yeah.
But what are some of the other things you can share with our listeners that maybe you see as a trend that our listeners should be aware of in terms of staying competitive, whether it's people, processes, or tech?
Well, I mean, I think that's a really good segue from the point that I was making with regards to strategic planning, because one of the big trends, particularly at the lower end of the middle market, that I see occurring is the existence of the annual summit. At the upper end of the middle market, this has been going on for years. The larger private equity firms can justify having an offsite for several days of not only the CEOs, but CFOs, COOs, and maybe they'll have a COO summit separately, maybe a CMO summit separately. Sometimes they bring them all together. And the reason that I say that this is an emerging trend and the reason that it matters is when you bring people together to collaborate, share wisdom, ideas, best practices, an opportunity to solve dilemmas that are being faced in one portfolio company, there is inevitably benefit that comes from what I call cross-pollination.
Yeah,
In other words,
absolutely.
if you've got a variety of different roles coming together to brainstorm, outside of the confines, the cozy confines of their office, their company, their industry, their customers, their competitors, and suddenly you bring them together to brainstorm on, just trends in technology, trends generally. How is this impacting our portfolio? What should we be doing differently? Hey, here's a problem I'm facing in my portfolio company. How are you handling that? There's benefit in having that cross-pollination across roles, but also cross-pollination across industries. So one of the reasons that I'll use the word love, that I love the Strategic Growth Council is it's essentially just that. It's sort of its own little microcosm of the concept of the offsite, the summit, the C-level summit. So maybe it's not an emerging trend, but I think it has tremendous implications for private equity. And I'll just finish that with a final thought. Just the idea that a private equity fund does not exist solely to ensure return on invested capital for the LPs, but rather has maybe a different purpose, an additional purpose. And that might be enabling portfolio companies to make better, more efficient, more effective strategic decisions as a result of, harnessing or cultivating the power, the experience, the wisdom, the insights that exist
Yeah.
within that cadre of portfolio company executives. So bringing them together for strategic planning makes a lot of sense, and thankfully it's taking root.
Yeah. Well, Kit, I really love the idea and the purpose of the Strategic Growth Council. And I agree. I think it's a very, very powerful idea. And, for one, it inspires reflection and learning. And, I think that especially for leaders of organizations where really the organization is relying on your leadership and guidance, I think we call it collaborative learning,
Right.
which frankly is the purpose of this podcast. 100% the purpose of this podcast is to share and learn from different disciplines and different fields and different people on how to contribute to organizational performance at the end of the day. And this idea that you had mentioned of harnessing and leveraging wisdom through collaborative learning is a very powerful idea.